Chapter 1 Transition of the 18th Century 1.1 Decline of the Mughal Empire founded by Zahiruddin Babur in 1526 and expanded to its full glory by Emperor Akbar in the second half of the 16th century. The Mughal Empire began to decline rapidly since the reign of its last great ruler Aurangzeb, I 658-1707. Even in the first half of the 17th century, its capital Delhi was considered to be the major power center in the entire Eastern Hemisphere. But within 50 years the signs of decline of this mighty empire were unmistakably visible. Some historians ascribe Aurangzeb's divisive policies for this rapid decline. Particularly blamed are his religious policies, which alienated the Hindus who constituted the majority of the subject population. His expansionist military campaigns in western India against the two autonomous states of Bijapur and Golconda and against the Marathas are also believed to have sapped the vitality of the empire. But some other historians believe that the roots of Mughal decline lay in institutions and systems intrinsic to Mughal administration, rather than in personalities or specific policies. There is, however, less dispute about the fact that the process of decline had set in during the time of Aurangzeb and that it could not be arrested by his weak successors. The situation was further worsened by recurrent wars of succession. The Mughal army was weakened, allegedly because of a lamentable dearth of able commanders. There was no military reform and no new technology. This weakening of the Mughal military power encouraged internal rebellions and invited foreign invasions. The Marathas under Shivaji had time and again challenged Aurangzeb's imperial rule. After his death the Maratha plunders increased. In 1738 they plundered even the suburbs of Delhi. This was followed by the Persian invasion under Nadir Shah in 1783 and the sack of Delhi, which was a tremendous blow to the prestige of the empire. A brief recovery followed and the first Afghan invasion in 1748 was repelled. But the Afghans https:// Chapter 1 Transition of the 18th From Plassey to Partition under Ahmad Shah Abdali again struck back, took over Punjab and sacked Delhi in 1756-57. To repel the Afghans, the Mughals sought help from the Marathas, but the latter were also defeated by Abdali at the Battle of Panipat in 1761. The Afghan menace did not last long, because a revolt in the army forced Abdali to retire to Afghanistan. But the political situation in North India certainly signified the passing of the glorious days of Mughal Empire. Earlier historians like Sir J.N. Sarkar, 1932-50, believed that it was a crisis of personality. Weak emperors and incompetent commanders were responsible for this downfall of the mighty Mughal Empire. But then, other historians like T.G.P. Spear, 1973, have pointed out that there was no dearth of able personalities in 18th century India. It was indeed a period marked by the activities of such able politicians and generals as the Sayyid brothers, Nizam al-Mulk, Abdus Samad Khan, Zakaria Khan, Sadat Khan, Safdar Jung, Moshid Quli Khan or Savai J.I. Singh. But unfortunately, all these able statesmen were preoccupied more in self-aggrandizement and had little concern for the fate of the empire. So, at times of crisis, they could not provide leadership and even directly contributed to the process of decline. But this need not be considered as personal failures, as it was more due to the weaknesses inherent in the Mughal institutions, which had evolved gradually in the 16th and 17th centuries. The Mughal Empire has been described as a war state. In its core. 1 It sought to develop a centralized administrative system, whose vitality depended ultimately on its military power. The emperor stood at the apex of this structure, his authority resting primarily on his military might. Below him the other most important element in this structure was the military aristocracy. In the late 16th century, Akbar had organized this aristocracy through his Mansabdari system, which meant a military organization of the aristocracy, its basis primarily being personal loyalty to the emperor. Every aristocrat was called a Mansabdar, with the dual numerical rank Jak and Savajak signifying his personal rank and Sava the number of horsemen he was required to maintain. This dual numerical rank also indicated the position of a particular nobleman in the overall Mughal bureaucracy. Sometimes they were paid in cash, Nakvi Mansabda, but most often they were paid in the form of a jagir or landed estate, the estimated revenue income, jama, of which would cover his personal salary and the maintenance allowance for his soldiers and horses. There were two types of jagir: transferable or tanka jagir and non-transferable or Oatan jagir. Transition of the 18th century. Three were transferable. The non-transferable jagirs were only a device to incorporate the locally powerful Rajats and Zamindars into the Mughal system, by proclaiming their autonomous chiefdoms. There were Tanjagirs. Appointment, promotion or dismissal of Mansabdars and allocation or transfer of jagirs were done only by the emperor, and so the members of the aristocracy only had personal loyalty to the emperor himself. Any form of impersonal loyalty, national, ethnic or religious, could not develop in Mughal India, and so the entire imperial edifice stood on a patron-client relationship, existing between the emperor and the ruling class. To the effectiveness and the permanence of this relationship depended on the personal qualities of the emperor and the constant expansion of resources, which explains the constant drive towards territorial conquests in Mughal India. There were no more conquests since the late years of Aurangzeb, and this was supposedly followed by a period of constant shrinkage of the resources of the empire. This is what ruptured, as some historians argue, the functional relationship between the emperor and the aristocracy, on which depended the efficiency of the imperial administration. To understand how this diminishing loyalty of the aristocrats could affect the Mughal Empire, a close look at the composition of this ruling class is called for. Lineage or ethnic background was the single most important factor in matters of appointment as Mansabdars. A great majority of the Mughal nobles were outsiders who had come from various parts of Central Asia. But they were gradually Indianist, although this Indianization took place without any coherent policy of the empire. The aristocracy was therefore divided into various ethno-religious groups, the most powerful among them being the Turani and the Irani groups. Those who came from the Turkish-speaking regions of Central Asia were called the Turanis, while those who came from the Persian-speaking regions of present-day Iran, Afghanistan and Iraq were called the Iranis. The Turanis were Sunnis and the Iranis were Shias, which lent a religious color to their mutual animosity and jealousy. Though the Mughals belonged to the Turani ethnic lineage, they did not show any personal favor to the Turanis. The other groups among the nobility were the Afghans, Sheikh-Jadas or the Indian Muslims, and the Hindus. The latter group mainly consisted of the Rajputs and Marathas, whose incorporation was because of specific political needs of the empire. After Aurangzeb conquered the two Deccan kingdoms of Bijapur, 1685, and Golconda, 1689, the noblemen who were in the http 4 from Plassey to Partition employ of those two kingdoms were absorbed into the Mughal aristocracy, and they came to form what is known as the Deccan Ii Group. It was primarily during the last years of Aurangzeb, due to the incorporation of the Maratha and Deccan nobles, that the composition of the Mughal aristocracy underwent a dramatic change, which brought to the surface the latent contradictions within its ranks. 3. The mutual rivalry and competition among these groups of nobles, as it is argued by some historians, came to a head supposedly because of an 18th century economic crisis. About 4/5 of the land revenue income of the Mughal Empire was under the control of the Mansabdars, but this income was very unevenly distributed. In the middle of the 17th century, out of about 8,000 Mansabdars, only 445 controlled 61% of the revenue income of the empire. For this naturally created jealousy and tension within the aristocracy, particularly when the resources of the empire were stagnant or even diminishing. This economic situation, known as the Jagirdari crisis of the 18th century, has been defined by Satish Chandra in the following words: the available social surplus was insufficient to defray the cost of administration, pay for wars of one type or another, and to give the ruling class a standard of life in keeping with its expectations. 5. This happened because of the unusual increase in the number of Mansabdars at a time when the area to be distributed as Jagir, or Pabaki, remained stagnant or even declined. Revenue collection, particularly in the south, fell far short of the estimated income, diminishing in turn the real income of the Jagirdars in disturbed areas. To make matters worse, there was a continuous price rise since the late 17th century, as the supply of luxury goods flowed towards the European markets, putting the Mughal aristocracy in further distress. 6. As too many Mansabdars were now chasing too few Jagirs, many of them had to remain Jagirless for years, and even when a Jagir was assigned, there was no guarantee that they would not be transferred within a short period. The entire aristocracy, therefore, suffered from a tremendous sense of personal insecurity. This Jagir crisis was not, however, a new phenomenon, as there had always been gaps between collection of revenue and the estimated revenue income of a particular Jagir. The crisis increased during the last years of Aurangzeb, mainly because of the Deccan Wars. There was now a rise in the number of Mansabdars, and the political turmoil made the collection of revenue a more difficult task. J.F. Richards, 1975, has argued that the problem was to some extent artificial and due to ruling policies of Aurangzeb, who was H.T. Transition of the 18th century 5 constantly expanding the size of the royal land or Khalisa. There was a 23% revenue increase after the conquest of Bijapur and Golconda. But instead of distributing this extra income among his Mansabdars, Aurangzeb wanted to use these resources to finance his Deccan campaign. So the newly conquered lands were incorporated into the royal Khalisa land, its revenue income going directly into the imperial treasury to meet the salary demands of the soldiers fighting in the south. An opportunity to solve the Jagirdari crisis was thus lost, and therefore Richards thinks that this crisis was artificial and not due to any real scarcity of resources. He has shown, however, that revenue collections in the Deccan were gradually falling, while Satish Chandra argues that Deccan always was a deficit area. So, it is difficult to say conclusively how the conquest of Bijapur and Golconda would have really solved the Jagir problem. But whether artificial or real, the Jagir crisis is believed to have led to an unhealthy competition among the nobles in order to have control over good Jagirs. Group politic at the Mughal court became an order of the day, each group wanting to have influence over the emperor to get access to good Jagirs. After the death of Bahadur Shah in 1712, the problem reached crisis proportions, as now the low-ranking officials found it real hard to maintain their lifestyle with what they got from their Jagirs, as revenue collection became increasingly difficult. The problem intensified further during the reigns of Jahandar Shah, 1712-13, and Farrukhsiyar, 1713-19. It did not improve at all during the reign of Muhammad Shah, 1,71,948, when Mansabdari ranks were distributed indiscriminately for political reasons, leading to further inflation in the numbers of aristocrats. To meet their increasing demands, portions of Khalisa land were converted into Jagir. This measure could not fully solve the problems of the Mansabdars, but impoverished the emperor. Nizam al-Mulk, after becoming Wazir, Prime Minister, tried to solve the problem through a redistribution of land. But he could not follow it through, because of strong opposition from within the court. 7. Politicking at the imperial court was at its height during this time. More generally, the Mughal nobility was divided into three warring factions: the Irani group led by Asad Khan and his son Zulfikar Khan, the Turani group, led by Ghazi-ud-Din Khan, Feroz Jung and his son Chin Kulik Khan, Nizam-ul-Mulk, and the Hindustani group led by the Sayyid brothers, Khan-i-Doran, some Afghan leaders and some Hindus. These factions were not organized around ethnicity or religion, but more on family ties, personal friendship and above all selfish interests. This faction fighting never went beyond Iraq/IIC, Arabian Sea, map. Transition of the 18th century. The imperial court, nor lapsed into violent confrontations. No one questioned the divine right of the Timurids to rule, but every group tried to extend their influence over the emperors to control the distribution of patronage. Proximity of any particular group to the center of power naturally alienated the others, and this gradually affected the personal bonds of loyalty between the emperor and his noblemen, as disaffected groups found no reason to espouse the cause of the empire. And what was worse, this resulted in corruption in the army. No mansabdar maintained the required number of soldiers and horses, and there was no effective supervision either. This weakening of the army was fatal for the empire, as ultimately the stability of the empire depended on its military might. That the Mughal army was no longer invincible was successfully shown by the Maratha leader Shivaji. This decline of the army became more palpable, as there was no fresh technological input or organizational innovation. The nobles now were more interested in carving out autonomous or semi-autonomous principalities for themselves, which resulted in a virtual fragmentation of the empire. Recurring peasant revolts in the late 17th and the early 18th centuries are also believed to have been a major cause of the decline of the Mughal Empire, and it is not unlikely that the crisis of the ruling elites had something to do with them. An empire imposed from above and its gradually increasing economic pressures were perhaps never fully accepted by the rural society, and the regional sentiments against a centralized power had also been there. Peasant unrest was therefore a recurrent theme in the history of the Mughal state ever since its inception. But fear of the Mughal army always acted as a deterrent and prevented the problem from blowing out of proportion. In the late 17th to 18th centuries, as the weaknesses of the central power became apparent and the Mughal army faced successive debacles, and at the same time the oppression of the Mughal ruling class increased, resistance to imperial authority also became widespread and more resolute. In most cases, these rebellions were led by the disaffected local zemindars and backed fully by the oppressed peasantry. Eventually the combined pressure of the zemindars and peasants often proved to be too much for the Mughal authority to withstand. These revolts can be interpreted in various ways. They can be portrayed as political assertion of regional and communitarian identities against an intruding centralizing power, or as reactions against the bigoted religious policies of Aurangzeb. The latter interpretation seems to be more unlikely, as in the later pan of his reign, Aurangzeb Ht. 8 from Plassey to Partition was showing more liberalism towards the non-believers and in fact wooing many of the Hindu local chieftains in a cool calculating move to win their loyalty and solve the political problems of the empire by isolating his enemies. 8 But the real reasons behind these revolts, as some historians argue on the other hand, could be found in the property relations of the Mughal Empire. Whether or not the emperor was the owner of all lands in his empire is a debatable issue, but he certainly had an unquestionable right over the income of the land which was collected in the form of land revenue, the amount of which was gradually increasing since the Sultana period. Irfan Habib, 1963, has shown that the Mughal land revenue system rested on a compromise. The peasant was left with sufficient provision for subsistence while the surplus, as far as possible, was extracted by the state in the form of land revenue. It is not true that the Mughal peasant was left with no surplus at all. For continuing production, he was certainly left with some, while differentiation within the peasantry also indicates that. But on the whole, although larger peasants could withstand the pressure, the smaller peasantry increasingly felt oppressed. 9 Usually in the Zabt areas, where a detailed land survey was undertaken, the revenue demand was 1/3 of the produce, but the actual amount varied from region to region. In some areas it was half of the produce, and in fertile regions like Gujarat it was as high as 3/4. Part of it, collected from the Khalisa land, went to the imperial treasury, while the larger portion, 80% in Aurangzeb's time, went to the Jagirdars. Below the demand of the state and above that of the peasants, there was another kind of demand on the income of the land, and that was the demand of the local landlords or zemindars. There was differentiation among the zarnindars. Some of them, like the Rajput chiefs of Rajasthan, were fairly big rajas with considerable local political power. They were incorporated into the Mughal bureaucracy, as in return for a fixed payment, peshkash, and loyalty to the emperor, their autonomous power over their own territory or Oatan was recognized. At the bottom were the Mulgujari or primary zemindars, who had an independent right over the land, and in many cases it was through them that revenue was collected from the peasants, and in return they got nanka or revenue-free land. Between these two groups were the intermediary zemindars, who collected revenue from their own zemindary as well from other primary zemindars. Below the zemindars were the peasants, who were also differentiated. The kurkashts were peasants with occupancy rights, while the pahikastes were vagrant peasants. There were close community HTT. Transition of the 18th century 9 relations based on caste, clan and religion between the primary zemindars and the peasants. This was an important source of power for the zemindars, many of whom controlled small armies and fought. The Mughal administration in the interior could not therefore function without their active cooperation. Akbar had tried to turn the zemindars into collaborators, but from the late years of Aurangzeb, particularly after the War of Succession, 1707-8, following his death, the loyalty of the zemindars definitely began to flounder. In the Deccan, towards the last years of Bahadur Shah's reign, all the zemindars, both primary and intermediary, turned against the Mughal state with the active support of the hard-pressed peasantry. 12 One major reason for the open defiance of the local landlords might have been the increasing oppression of the Jagirdars. The earlier emperors tried to keep them in check through a system of rotation. Irfan Habib, 1963, has argued that because of this Mughal system, and by taking advantage of it, the Jagirdars oppressed the peasantry. As they were frequently transferred, they did not develop any attachment or any long-term interest in the estate and tried to exact as much as possible during their short tenures, without any consideration for the peasants. Their natural oppressive propensities remained within certain limits only because of constant imperial supervision, but this supervisory system totally collapsed in the 18th century. The overneedy nobles who could resist or defy transfer, developed local power bases and by using that tried to extract as much as possible. This trend was quite visible in Golconda after its subjugation. Later, in the last years of Bahadur Shah's reign, a number of Jagirdars in the Deccan made compromises with the Maratha Sardars, chiefs, and that arrangement allowed them to collect as much as possible from the peasantry. Sometimes they collected advances from the amils, revenue officials, who in turn extorted as much as they could from the peasants. 14 On the other hand, those who were more frequently transferred found the local conditions too turbulent for the collection of revenue. To solve this problem and to squeeze maximum benefit within a short period, they devised the ijaradari system, through which revenue collecting right was farmed out to the highest bidder. The revenue farmers' demand was often much higher than the actual revenue demand, and the pressures ultimately moved downward to the primary zemindars and the peasants. During the reign of Farrukh Shiah's reign, even Khalisa lands were being given over to the ijaradars. The Mughal compromise is believed to have completely broken down as a result, and the primary zemindars began to defy the Mughal state for their own share of the surplus. In the outlying and more disturbed areas, such as Deccan, zemindari defiance became an order of the day. Even in the heart of Mughal North India in the 18th century, there was a widespread tendency among the zemindars to defy the central authority, withhold revenue payment and to resist the Mughal state when it forcibly tried to collect it. Is because of their community ties with the peasants, they could easily mobilize them against the Mughal power. For the peasants also, this zemindari initiative solved the problem of leadership, as they often found it difficult to challenge on their own a centralized authority and continue their struggle for a very long time. The peasant grievances in late Mughal period were, therefore, often organized around religious and regional identities. The Maratha Sardars took advantage of the peasant grievances. The Jat peasants were mobilized in North India by their zemindars. The Sikhs rose in revolt in Punjab, and the Rajput chiefs withdrew their allegiance in Rajasthan. All these revolts led to the formation of autonomous kingdoms in different parts of the empire, further attenuating the authority of the Mughals. The 18th century thus witnessed the rise of a variety of regional states, some of which built on older local or regional traditions, of state formation, others focused on ethnic identity and associated notions of community. 16 By the end of the century, effective rule of the Mughal emperor was confined only to a narrow stretch around the capital city of Delhi. In 185-8, when the English deposed the last emperor Bahadur Shah II, they only ended the fiction of his imperial. To some historians, however, poverty and economic pressure do not seem to be a wholly adequate explanation for these rebellions and the eventual decline of the Mughal state, since there had been significant regional variations in local economies. The recent, revisionist, literature, therefore, wants us to move away from this centrist view and to look at the situation from a different perspective, a perspective of the periphery. The Mughal decline, according to this new history, is the result of the rise of new groups into economic and political power and the inability of a distant and weakened center to control them any longer. In the entire history of Mughal Empire there is more evidence of prosperity and growth than of decline and crisis. There is no denying that even in the 18th century there had been regions with surplus resources, like for example, Moradabad, Bareilly, Awadh and Banaras, but the Mughal state could not appropriate this surplus and the resources accumulated in the hands of local zamindars. 17 Bengal was another surplus area. In eastern Bengal, vast stretches of 4-cent land was being trucked around this time, and the settlers of these new areas gave distinct religious and political orientation to their newly established agrarian communities, while the provincial officials could easily carve out for themselves new revenue units around these agrarian settlements. The rising agricultural production in some areas and monetization of the economy, in other words, made available more resources at the disposal of the zamindars and peasants, and powerful local lineages, who gained distinctively greater advantage and confidence vis-à-vis the imperial center. Taking advantage of a weakening central control, they now found it more convenient to repudiate their allegiance to a centralized imperial power and assert their autonomy, while still maintaining the cultural and ideological framework of the Mughal state. Possibilities for such diffusion of power had always been there in Mughal India, it has been argued. There were corporate groups and social classes who enjoyed, despite a supposedly obtrusive central authority, various kinds of rights that constituted, in C.A. Bailey's terminology, their portfolio capital, which they could invest to reap huge profits. 20 According to this school of history, throughout the Mughal period there had been a constant process of reconciliation and adjustment between the central power and the regional elite. Mughal sovereignty, as Andre Wink has argued, rested on a balancing system of continually shifting rivalries and alliances. The Mughal system was prepared to accommodate jitna, or sedition, and always tried to incorporate the ascendant localized powers, either indigenous or foreign, into its concept of universal dominion, and on the effective functioning of this mechanism of conciliation and coercion depended its continued existence. The Mughal process of centralization, in other words, left enough space for the continued existence of rival principles of organization. Frank Perlin, in this context, has talked about the existence of a library of categories and techniques, implying a multiplicity of systems of governance, methods of measurement and techniques of collecting revenue, varying widely in space and rhyme. There was multiplicity of rights, like the concept of watan in the Deccan, which meant heritable rights that could not be taken away even by kings. Attempts at centralization could not eliminate those rights in the 18th century. 22 So, as Muzaffar Alam sums up the situation, around this time, because of decentralization and commercialization, a group of upstarts had come to monopolize the resources of the empire at the exclusion of the hereditary Mughal nobility or the Khanjads. 23 These upstarts were the new regional power elite who rose to prominence in the http provinces and successfully contested the centralizing tendency of the Mughal state. This group included the Jagirdars who defied transfer and thus became local rulers, and the revenue farmers or the new entrepreneurs in revenue, who combined military power with expertise in managing cash and local trade. 24 consistent economic growth and prosperity, rather than poverty and crisis, thus provided the context of the local political turmoil. The Mughal system, in other words, had always left a space for the rise of powerful regional groups, and significant economic and social changes in the 18th century brought that possibility into sharper focus. But then these new developments were not properly recognized or accommodated within the system, and hence its eventual demise. It is difficult to arrive at a convenient middle ground between the conventional and revisionist histories, nor is it easy to dismiss either of them. The revisionist history has been taken to task for underestimating the cohesiveness of the Mughal Empire and for ignoring the contemporary Muslim concepts of centralized sovereignty. These critics, on the other hand, have been assailed for clinging on to a mindset that is accustomed to look at the Mughal Empire only as a centralized structure. 26. If there is any shared ground at all, as Al-Atar Ali admits in his critique of the revisionist historiography, it is in the common recognition of the fact that the Zanindas or the intermediary classes constituted a centrifugal force in the Mughal structure. 27. We may, however, conclude by saying that the idea of decline is perhaps an inadequate theme for understanding the 18th century in Indian history. The Mughal system continued even long after the de facto demise of the empire, which was followed by the emergence of a number of regional powers. The 18th century in Indian history is not a dark age, nor an age of overall decline. The decline of one pan-Indian empire was followed by the rise of another, the intervening period being dominated by a variety of powerful regional states. This century should, therefore, be considered, as Satish Chandra, 1991, has argued, as a distinct chronological whole. 1.2 Emergence of the regional powers. By 1761 the Mughal Empire was empire only in name, as its weaknesses had enabled the local powers to assert their independence. Yet the symbolic authority of the Mughal emperor continued, as he was still considered to be a source of political legitimacy. The new states did not directly challenge his authority and constantly sought his sanction to legitimize their rule. In many areas of transition of the 18th century, 13 states continued the Mughal institutions and the administrative system, where changes occurred, and they did occur. Of course they came rather lowly, to accommodate the altered power relations in the regions. The emergence of these scares in the 18th century, therefore, represented a transformation rather than collapse of the polity. It signified a decentralization of power and not a power vacuum or political chaos. These new states were of various kinds with diverse histories. Some of them were founded by Mughal provincial governors, some were set up by the rebels against the Mughal state, and a few states which asserted their independence were previously functioning as autonomous but dependent polities. Bengal, Hyderabad and Awadh were the three successor states of the Mughal Empire, in the sense that they were founded by Mughal provincial governors who never formally severed their links with the centre, but virtually exercised autonomy in matters of execution of power at the local level. The province or the Subah of Bengal gradually became independent of Mughal control after Murshid Quli Khan became the governor in 1717-2s. Initially, Aurangzeb had appointed him the Diwan, collector of revenue, of Bengal to streamline the revenue administration of the province. Then in 1710 Bahadur Shah reappointed him in this position after a short break of 2 years. When Farrukhsia became the emperor, he confirmed Murshid Quli in his position and also appointed him the deputy governor of Bengal and governor of Orissa. Later in 1717 when he was appointed the governor or Nazim of Bengal, he was given the unprecedented privilege of holding the two offices of Nazim and Diwan simultaneously. The division of power, which was maintained throughout the Mughal period to keep both the imperial officers under control through a system of checks and balances, was thus done away with. This helped Murshid Quli, who was already known for his efficient revenue administration, to consolidate his position further. He did not of course formally defy Mughal authority and regularly sent revenue to the imperial treasury. Indeed, The Bengal revenue was often the only regular income for the beleaguered Mughal emperors during periods of financial stringency and uncertainty. But behind the veneer of formal allegiance to the Timurid rulers, Murshid Quli began to enjoy a considerable amount of autonomy within his own domain and initiated almost a dynastic rule. He was indeed the last governor of Bengal appointed by the Mughal emperor. The foundation of Murshid Quli's power was of course his very successful revenue administration, which even in the days of political chaos elsewhere in the empire, made Bengal a constant revenue. 14 From Plassey to Partition paying surplus area. It is difficult to determine whether or not he was oppressive or that revenue demand during his period increased significantly, but revenue collection had shot up by 20% between 1700 and 1722. This efficient collection system was operated through powerful intermediary zemindars. Murshid Quli sent his investigators to every revenue-paying area to make a detailed survey and compelled the zemindars to pay in full and on time. For this purpose, he encouraged the development of a few powerful zemindaries at the expense of smaller inefficiently managed zemindaries, while refractory zemindars were punished and some of the jagirdars were transferred to the outlying province of Orissa, their estates being converted into khalisa or royal land. 29 The period between 1717 and 1726 therefore witnessed the emergence of a few landed magnates. These magnates assisted the Nazim in the timely collection of revenue, and with his patronage they also expanded their own estates. 30 Indeed, by the time of Murshid Quli's death in 1727, 15 largest zemindaries were responsible for about half of the revenue of the province. But along with the rise of the zemindars as a new powerful elite in the province, there was also the growing importance of merchants and bankers during this period. Bengal always had a lucrative trade, and the political stability and increase in agricultural productivity during Murshid Quli's period provided further impetus to such trading activities. In the 17th century, silk and cotton textile, sugar, oil and clarified butter from Bengal went through overland route to Persia and Afghanistan via a number of North and West Indian distributing centers and on the oceanic route through the port of Hooghly to the Southeast Asian, Persian Gulf and Red Sea ports. During the political turmoil of the 18th century, traffic through the overland route partially declined, but oceanic trade thrived with increasing investment from the European companies, the Dutch, the French and the English. During the first half of the century, Europe certainly became the major destination for goods from Bengal, and this had a significant impact on the textile industry in the region. Bengal always enjoyed a favorable balance of trade, with surplus bullion brought in by the European companies to buy Bengal goods, and this was absorbed smoothly into the cash economy and revenue remittance structure. On the Indian side, this trade was dominated by a variety of merchants, Hindus, Muslims and Armenians. Some of them were magnates, like the Hindu merchant Umi Chand or the Armenian tycoon Khoja Wajid, who controlled a fleet of ships. And they enjoyed a very cordial relation with the state. And bureaucracy, as the Mughal state traditionally never tried to squeeze the merchants. On the other hand, the constant pressure on the zemindars to pay revenue in time and its regular remittance to the imperial treasury in Delhi brought powerful financiers and bankers into great demand. They provided securities at every stage of the transaction and enjoyed unprecedented patronage of the governor, thus providing the main supportive pillar of his power. The most significant story of such collaboration was the rise of the banking house of J. Agar Sheikh, who eventually became the treasurer of the provincial government in 1730, with strategic control over the mint. Apart from zemindars, merchants and bankers, Murshid Quli also ensured the loyalty of the officials, by appointing his friends, relatives and loyalists in important positions and driving his potential enemies out of the province, a situation which could not be dreamt of in the heyday of the Mughal Empire. Murshid Quli, however, never did sever his formal connections with the Mughals and continued to send the annual Bengal revenue to Delhi regularly. but within his own domain he acted as an autonomous ruler and in a true dynastic fashion named his daughter's son Sarfaraz Khan his successor. But Sarfaraz was ousted by his father Shujuddin Muhammad Khan, Murshid Quli's son-in-law, who took control of the two provinces of Bengal and Orissa in 1727 and had his position endorsed by the Mughal Emperor Muhammad Shah. He too maintained the relationship with the Mughal court, but enjoyed autonomy in matters of local administration, which was supported by the new forces of Bengal politics, the Zamindars, merchants and the bankers. By the 1730s, as Philip Calkins argues, the government of Bengal began to look more like government by cooperation of the dominant forces in Bengal, rather than the imposition of the rule from outside. However, it is also true that this gradual rise in the power of the merchants, bankers and zamindars also meant a relative diminution of the authority of the Nazim. This became quite evident in a coup in 1739-40, in which Shujuddin's son Sarfaraz Khan, who had become the new Nazim, was ousted by his army commander Alivadi Khan, with the help of the banking family of Yagak Sehs and a few powerful zamindars. Sarfaraz had to go not just because he was an inefficient administrator, but because he had alienated the house of Jagak Seh, and had lost the support of a few powerful officials. With his deposition, the office of the Nazim went to an able military general, Alivadi Khan, who later obtained imperial sanctions for his appointment. It was Alivadi's reign, which marked a virtual break with the Mughals. All major appointments were now made without any 16 from Plassey to Partition reference to the emperor, and finally, the regular flow of revenue to Delhi was stopped. Although there was never any formal defiance of the Mughal authority, for all practical purposes an autonomous administration, free of all sorts of imperial control, had now emerged in Bengal, Bihar and Orissa. The major problems for Alivadi came from outside. He had to face Maratha depredations and Afghan rebellion. The Marathas from the west in their search for a pan-Indian empire invaded Bengal a number of times, causing immense damage to life and property. Ultimately in 1751, Alivadi came to terms with the Marathas by agreeing to pay Chauth, 1/4 of the revenue, and handing over Orissa. But in the meanwhile some rebel Afghan troops under the leadership of Mustafa Khan had taken over Patna in 1748 and thus had posed another great challenge to his authority. Alivadi eventually succeeded in putting down the Afghans and recovered Parma. However, one major fallout of the Maratha raids was the disruption of Bengal trade, particularly of the overland trade with North and West India. But it was short-lived and the recovery was aided by a massive increase in European trade, both corporate trade of the companies and private trade of their officials. They could not immediately dislodge the Indian merchants from the market, but it certainly signified the beginning of European dominance in the trading world of Bengal, preparing the ground for an eventual English takeover of the province 34, a development we shall discuss in detail later. Alivadi died in 1756, nominating his grandson Sirajuddaula his successor. But his succession was challenged by two other contenders for the throne, Shaukat Jung, Faujdar of Pune, and Ghasseti Begum, Alivadi's daughter. This resulted in intense court factionalism, as the overmighty zamindars and commercial people felt threatened by an extremely ambitious and assertive young Nawab. This destabilized the administration of Bengal, and the advantage was taken by the English East India Company, which acquired a foothold in Bengal politics through what is popularly known as the Plassey conspiracy of 1757 that ended the rule of Sirajuddaula. This story of yet another transition in Bengal politics we shall see in a short while. The autonomous kingdom of Hyderabad was founded in 1724 by a powerful noble at the imperial court, Chin Kulik Khan, who eventually took the title of Nizam-ul-Mulk Asaf, known as the leader of the Thurani party. He felt frustrated in court politics due to the haughty assertion of power by the Indian Muslim faction led by the Sayyid brothers, who had Emperor Farrukhsiyar killed and Muhammad Shah installed on the throne as a puppet ruler in 1719. https://telegram.me 16 from Plassey to Partition reference to the emperor, and finally, the regular flow of revenue to Delhi was stopped. Although there was never any formal defiance of the Mughal authority, for all practical purposes an autonomous administration, free of all sorts of imperial control, had now emerged in Bengal, Bihar and Orissa. The major problems for Alivadi came from outside. He had to face Maratha depredations and Afghan rebellion. The Marathas from the west, in their search for a pan-Indian empire, invaded Bengal. To save the Timurid rule from being subverted in this way, Nizam-ul-Mulk organized the Thurani and Irani noblemen against the Sayyids and ultimately defeated and killed them in 1720. Muhammad Shah was restored to the throne and Nizam-ul-Mulk acted as his wazir from 1722 to 1724. But eventually he found that carving out an autonomous principality in the Deccan for himself was more attractive. In Hyderabad, Mubarak Khan, the Mughal governor of Deccan, was ruling almost as an independent king. In 1723 the Nizam defeated Mubarak and the following year he took over as the Subadar of Deccan and consolidated his power around Hyderabad. The actual independence of the Hyderabad kingdom may be dated from 1740, when finally the Nizam left North India to settle there permanently. He subdued the refractory Zamindars and showed tolerance towards the Hindus who had economic power in their hands, and as a result, Hyderabad witnessed the emergence of a new regional elite who supported the Nizam. By the rime of his death in 1748, the state of Hyderabad was a recognizable power in Deccan politics, acknowledging Mughal suzerainty only in a symbolic sense. Coins were still minted in the name of the Mughal emperor. His name also figured in the khutbah or the Friday prayers. But for all practical purposes, the Nizam acted independently, conducting wars, signing treaties, conferring mansabs and making important appointments without any reference to the emperor. Soon, however, after the death of the first Nizam, Asaf Jahi, Hyderabad began to experience a series of crises. While Maratha depredations continued to be a major source of anxiety, a war of succession ensued between his son Nasir Jung and grandson Muzaffar Jung, the advantage of that disunion being taken by the French under Dupleix. Muzaffar emerged victorious from this contest with French support and gave handsome monetary rewards and territorial concessions to the French. But that did not end his problems, as during the subsequent years, the Marathas, Mysore and the Carnatic all settled their territorial scores against Hyderabad. The situation improved again after 1762 during the period of Nizam Ali Khan, who seized control of the administration, and during his long reign lasting up to 1803, he settled border disputes with his neighbors, giving Hyderabad the much desired political stability. The Hyderabadi administrative system did not try to destroy the indigenous power structures within the territory, but sought to incorporate them into a patron-client relationship with the central power. The locally entrenched semi-autonomous rulers were allowed to govern their inherited territory. Tribute or peshkash paid to the Nizam, the locally powerful traders, money lenders and the military aristocracy also played a crucial role in the Hyderabad polity, by providing valuable financial and military support to the Nizam, who emerged as the chief patron within the polity. Under this new administration, the old Mughal institutions were not totally thrown out, but they underwent substantial changes in content. Land revenue was collected through powerful intermediary revenue farmers, but unlike the Mughal practice, there was very little attempt to keep them under control. The juggers under this new system became hereditary and the Mansabdari system only retained a few of its Mughal features. There was also a remarkable change in the composition of the nobility. While the older military aristocracy retained some of its power, some new men with expertise in revenue and financial management rose from lower ranks. On the whole, power remained widely diffused in the Hyderabadi administrative structure. 36 By the end of the 18th century, Hyderabad represented a relatively new political system with a whole range of new participants, who had diverse origins and social background. Another Mughal province that became autonomous in the course of the 18th century was Awadh. Sadat Khan was appointed the Mughal governor of Awadh in I-722 with the difficult charge of subduing rebellions by the local rajas and chiefs. He accomplished this task within a year, and in appreciation, the Emperor Muhammad Shah conferred on him the title of Burhanul Mulk. Soon after this, Sadat Khan returned to the capital to consolidate his position in the imperial court, but ended up in a quarrel with one of Muhammad Shah's favorites and was again forced to return to Awadh. Frustrated in court politics, Sadat then decided to build up a power base in Awadh, and as a first step had his son-in-law Safdar Jung recognized by the emperor as his deputy governor. The other step towards the establishment of his dynastic rule was to make the office of Diwan virtually independent of all imperial control. The revenues of Awadh from then on were handled by a Punjabi Khatri official who functioned under Sadat Khan and never reported anything to the imperial office. The problem of refractory zamindars in Awadh was solved in time, and a new land revenue settlement was introduced, with the revenue demand increasing by more than half. The jagirdari system was reformed, with jagars being granted to the local gentry, while a rich flow of trade kept the province affluent. This resulted in the creation of a new regional ruling elite, consisting mainly of Indian Muslims, Afghans and Hindus, who became Sadat's main support base. But transmoan of the 18th century, the latter kept the communication channels open with the imperial court. Indeed, during this whole period he constantly expanded the frontiers of the Awadh Subah, but never without the formal approval of the emperor. He also nurtured his old ambitions in imperial court politics, but only to be frustrated again in 1739-40 when the position of Mir Baksi, imperial treasurer, went to the Nizam, despite the services he had rendered during the invasion of the Persian king Nadir Shah. He considered this a betrayal, and in vengeance changed sides to join the Persian invader. But he could not suffer the arrogance and haughty behavior of Nadir Shah, and the day after the occupation of Delhi, in sheer frustration and despondency, he poisoned himself to death. However, by the time he died in 1740, Sadat had certainly developed in Awadh a semi-autonomous regional political system, with vastly reduced financial commitment to, but no formal disjunction with, the Mughal rate. Nadir Shah remained the Emperor of India for just 2 months, and he settled the succession question in Awadh by accepting 20 million rupees as peshkash from Safdar Jung. Muhammad Shah later confirmed this appointment and conferred on him an imperial title. But Safdar Jung's opportunities really came when both Muhammad Shah and the Nizam-ul-Mulk died in 1748, and he was appointed wazir by the new Emperor Ahmad Shah. Safdar Jung extended his sphere of influence by using the new imperial position, the most important of these gains being the seizure of Farrukhabad from the Pathans. But on the other hand, this self-aggrandizement of the wazir soon alienated both the imperial family as well as the court nobles, who ultimately contrived his ouster in 1753. The year marked an important turning point in the political history of North India, as Richard Barnett points out, by signifying the visible secession of Awadh and Allahabad from the remainder of the dwindling empire. 37. The formal connection was yet to be severed fully. After Safdar Jung's death in late 1754, his only son Shuja-ud-Dawla was again appointed the governor of Awadh by the puppet Emperor Alamgir XI. And Shuja too successfully maintained the autonomy of the Awadh Subah without ever formally defying the symbolic authority of the Mughal emperor. When, in December 1759, on the death of Alamgir II, the fugitive crown prince staged his own coronation as Shah Alam II, he named Shuja his wazir. Although this position was merely fictional, Shuja maintained his power within his own domain and was a much sought-after ally for both the parties when Afghan leader Ahmad Shah Abdali arrived again in India to engage the Marathas in the Third Battle of Panipat. 120 from Plassey joined the Afghan invader to see his local opponents, the Marathas, humbled and weakened, but throughout this confrontation he behaved like an independent partner in an alliance of equals. Within his own domain of Awadh and Allahabad his autonomy and power remained unchallenged till his encounter with the English East India Company in 1764. J.S. Apart from these successor states formed by Mughal governors, the other states that emerged in 18th century India were those founded by rebels against the Mughal state, such as the Marathas, the Sikhs, the Jars and the Afghan kingdoms of Farrukhabad and Rohilkhand. Among them it was perhaps only the Maratha state that had the potential co-develop into a new pan-Indian empire replacing the Mughals, but that potential was never fully realized because of the nature of the Maratha polity itself. In the 17th century it began as a small kingdom in western India, founded by the legendary Maratha chief Shivaji, against stiff opposition from the local Muslim kingdom of Bijapur and the pressure of the mighty Mughal army. Soon after his death in 1680, it was troubled by dynastic factionalism and the constant pressure of the Mughal policy of conquest in the Deccan. Local Deshmukhs, revenue officers, and Zarnindars took advantage of the situation by sometimes aligning with the Mughals and sometimes joining hands with the Marathas. Two of Shivaji's sons, first Shambhaji and then Rajaram, ruled briefly and battled incessantly with the Mughal army. When Rajaram died in 1699, one of his queens, Tarabai, began to rule in the name of her infant son Shivaji XI, but Aurangzeb's army during this period conquered Maratha forts one after another, keeping Tarabai constantly on the move. From late 1705, however, the tide began to turn against Aurangzeb, and when he died in 1707 after 40 years of futile warfare in the Deccan, the Marathas still remained to be subjugated. The Maratha kingdom was, however, certainly weakened, and the process was further exacerbated after the release of Shahu, Shivaji's grandson, from the Mughal prison in 1707. There were now two rival contenders for the throne, and during the next 8 years, Maharashtra was immersed in a full-scale civil war between the forces of Shahu and those of Tarabai, who intended to rule in the name of Shivaji too. The loyalty of the Maratha Sardars and Deshmukhs shifted constantly between the two Maratha factions and the Mughals, the situation of anarchy becoming all-pervasive by 1712-13. But, helped by a group of new independent Sardars, as well as a number of Brahman banking families, and an able Chitpavan Brahman Peshwa, Prime Minister, Balaji Vishwanara, Shahu ultimately 22 from Plassey to Partition emerged victorious from this contest, and by 1718-19 he consolidated his position firmly. In 1719, by helping the Sayyid brothers establish a puppet emperor in Delhi, Balaji Viswanath secured for his master a Mughal Sanad, Imperial order, recognizing Shahu's right to Chauth and Sardeshmukhi, 1/4 and 1/10 respectively of the government revenue, in the 6 Mughal provinces of Deccan, Chauth of Malwa and Gujarat, and an independent status in Maharashtra. The contest with the Tarabai faction was settled later in the Treaty of Wama in 1731, which gave the state of Kolhapur to Shivaji too. Although Maratha civil war was brought to an end, the control of the state gradually passed on from the line of Shivaji to that of the Peshwas. Since the time of Balaji Viswanath, the office of the Peshwa became rapidly powerful and the fountainhead of authority and the source of all patronage in the entire Maratha kingdom. He died in 1720 and was succeeded by his son Baji Rao, who was in power till 1740. By then the Maratha state had acquired control over large territories of the Mughal Empire, and their only major adversary was the Nizam of Hyderabad, as both vied for control over Karnataka, Khandesh and Gujarat. In the first round of battle, the Marathas were defeated, but this was soon avenged in a resounding Maratha victory at Palke, March 1728, forcing the Nizam to recognize Shahu as the sole Maratha monarch with rights to Chauth and Sardeshmukhi of the Deccan. After that Baji Rao led military campaigns and acquired the fertile lands of Malwa, reaching Rajasthan by 1729.39. Meanwhile in Gujarat, Maratha bands collected taxes in the countryside, while the Mughals controlled only the cities. and the once lucrative trade in the port of Surat now declined rapidly under this political pressure. When Baji Rao sent a large Maratha army to Gujarat under his brother, the Mughal governor concluded two treaties in 1727 and 1728, in effect ceding 60% of the revenues of Gujarat to Shahu and his Peshwa. The Nizam made another attempt to humble the Peshwa by allying with some rival Maratha factions in Gujarat, Gakwad, Gavade and Kadam Band, but their combined forces were finally defeated by the Peshwa's army in 1731. Sometime later Baji Rai's attention was directed towards the coastal plains of Konkan, where by 1736 he gained control over the territories of the Siddhis, Abyssinian Muslims, and drove the Portuguese out of Salsette, Bassein and Choil. Then again he returned to the north and in 1737 attacked Delhi and held the emperor captive for some time. The following year, he defeated a huge Mughal army under the generalship of Nizam, and the Treaty of Bhopal that followed in January 1739 ceded to the Peshwa the Subah of Malwa and sovereignty over all lands between the rivers Narmada and Chambal. In these territories, however, the Marathas did not try to overturn the local power structure and quickly entered into negotiations with the local zemindars for the payment of yearly tributes. A civilian system of revenue administration took time to emerge in this newly conquered region, and this was a feature typical of all Maratha conquests. After the death of Baji Rao in 1740, Shahu appointed his son Balaji Bajirao, better known as Nana Sahib, 1740-61, in his place. More experienced in administration than in military campaigns, 42 he was, however, the most successful among the Peshwas. Nana Sahib became the supreme authority in the Maratha polity after the death of Shahu in 1749. This was indeed the peak period of Maratha glory, when all parts of India had to face Maratha depredations. In the east, from 1745 onwards, Maratha bands under Raghujib Bhonsle of Nagpur regularly raided Orissa, Bengal and Bihar, then ruled autonomously by Alivadi Khan. A treaty in 1751 stopped these raids, as Alivadi surrendered Orissa and agreed to pay 120,000 rupees as annual chauth payment for the three provinces. Near at home, the Maratha forces regularly raided the Nizam's territories in Konkan, exacted tributes, but never succeeded in completely subduing them. In the north, by the Treaty of Bhalke in 1751, Selabakjan, the new Nizam, practically ceded the entire control of Khandesh. Further north, the Maratha bands regularly raided the Rajput kingdoms of Jaipur, Bundi, Kota and Udaipur and the Gond kingdom of Deoghar. They intervened in their wars of succession, exacted annual tributes from their rulers, but never tried to have any permanent conquest in the region. In the face of an Afghan invasion overrunning Lahore and Multan, a treaty in 1752 brought the Mughal emperor under the protection of the Marathas, and a succession dispute in 1753 gave them the opportunity to install their own chosen candidate on the Mughal throne. The Maratha expedition to Punjab was, however, short-lived, and soon a Sikh rebellion put an end to Maratha authority in this region. In any case, the Marathas by then had gained mastery over large parts of North India, but there was never any attempt to establish an empire. It was only in Khandesh, Malwa and Gujarat that they tried to put in place some kind of an administration. Their conquest elsewhere would seldom go beyond plunder and levying of chauth and Sardeshmukhi. As a result, it was difficult to maintain this mastery, and soon an Afghan invasion under Ahmad Shah Abdali dealt a deadly blow to Abdali, though troubled by lack of discipline in his army, was supported in this contest by a number of other indigenous forces, like the Rohillas and Shujaudullah of Awadh. In the crucial Third Battle of Panipat fought on 14 January 1761, the Maratha forces under Sadasiv Rao Bho were routed by Abdali, causing about 50,000 casualties. This marked the beginning of the decline of Maratha power. The Peshwa died within weeks, and as the young Peshwa Madhav Rao tried to gain control of the polity, factionalism among the Maratha Sardars raised its ugly head. This faction fighting increased further after Madhav Rai's death in 1772. His uncle Raghunath Rao seized power, but was opposed by a number of important Maratha chiefs. To consolidate his position, he found a new ally in the English, then stationed in Bombay, but this took Maratha history into an entirely different trajectory, as the English had by then emerged as a new contender for power in the turbulent politics of 18th century India. The Maratha state could not become an alternative to Mughal Empire because of its own structure. Its nature was that of a confederacy where power was shared among the chiefs or sardars, like the Bhonsles of Nagpur, Gakwad of Baroda, Holkar of Indore or Sindhia of Gwalior, all of whom had made their fortunes as military leaders since the days of Shahu. Parts of the Maratha state had been alienated to these military commanders, and it was difficult to control the chiefs, who did not like the Peshwa regulating their activities. What resulted soon was increasing factional rivalry among the Maratha Sardars, and although there was always a strong center, the composition of the inner circle of power changed from generation to generation. At the lower level, as mentioned earlier, there was the existence of heritable Watan rights, like those of the village headmen, Mahsidars and Deshmukhs, which could not be taken away by kings. The regional assemblies of Watandars exercised political power and resolved disputes at a local level, thus representing local loyalties as opposed to any centralized concept of kingship. The Maratha state, in order to establish its control over the territory and consolidate the power base of its new ruling class, sought to peripheralize the regional assemblies in the 17th and early 18th centuries. It tried to replace the horizontal ethos of brotherhood of the Watandars with the vertical relationship of service by generously distributing among its clients temporary and transferable land rights or saranjam that resembled Mughal jagir. But the old system could not be displaced, as the new system of prebend lordship, as Frank Perlin has argued, often cut across the traditional hierarchies of HTTP. Successive Raudho were routed by Abdali, causing about 50,000 casualties. Transbone of the 18th century 25 status. So the same locally powerful Brahman or Maratha individuals now enjoyed a bundle of different kinds of rights. Local loyalties and centralized kingship thus continued to exist in Deccan through a continuous process of adjustment and balancing. There is a significant debate about the relationship between the Maratha state and the Mughal system, as some historians emphasize its rebel nature. Lafan Habib, 1963, thinks that it was the outcome of a Zamindar revolt against an oppressive Mughal bureaucracy. Satish Chandra, 1993, has argued about its regional nature. Although Baji Rao made a move towards North India, his major aim was only to establish supremacy in the Deccan. In other words, the Maratha state is often seen as a departure from the Mughal tradition. But some other historians like Andre Wynne have argued that the Marathas were also very much within the Mughal tradition, as they had built their power on the notion of sedition or ichua, the Deccani corruption of the word fitna, which the Mughal state always provided a space for. There was no rebellion, as such, as concurrent rights constituted sovereignty. Even in the 1770s the Marathas acknowledged the symbolic authority of the Mughal emperor, and in Malwa, Khandesh and parts of Gujarat, where they established some sort of administration, it looked very much like the Mughal system. The old terminology was retained, and even the differential urban tax rates continued to favor the Muslims. The only difference was that in the Maratha territories there were many civilian revenue collectors, mainly Brahmins, who did not move on to military command, as was the custom in the Mughal system where there was only one unified civilian military bureaucracy. 46 Other than this, the Mughal tradition remained central to social and political life of the Maratha state system, although, as we have noted earlier, it had to contend continually with local loyalties. Existing political conflicts between warrior families were resolved through a combination of coercion and conciliation, the Deshmukhs remaining the co-sharers in the polity and rights being granted for building kingdoms. The Maratha state ultimately declined not so much because of factionalism, but because of the increasing power of the English in the Deccan. It was difficult for the Marathas to resist this efficient army. Turning to North India in the 18th century, we find that the history of the Sikh Panth in Punjab was as old as that of the Mughal Empire. When Guru Nanak, born in 1469, began to preach his message of inner devotion and equality among all human beings, Babur was founding the Mughal Empire. Within the Bhakti Sant tradition of medieval India, this was the beginning of Sikhism, which gradually began to attract millions of devotees and started acquiring HTT 26 from Plassey to PR Phylon its shape and definition under the leadership of the subsequent Gurus. 7. Aurangzeb was initially not very hostile to the Sikhs, but as the community grew in size and challenged the central authority of the Mughals, the emperor turned against them and Guru Tegh Bahadur, the ninth in line, was executed in Delhi in 1675. The 10th Guru, Guru Gobind Singh, took an important step in 1699. He transformed the Sikhs into a military organization by establishing the Brotherhood of Khalsa. It was a ceremony in which the Guru himself, and not his deputies or muezzins, initiated the disciples, who were obliged to maintain 5 distinctive insignia including unkempt hair and carrying of weapons that would publicly proclaim their identity. Why he did it is a matter of conjecture. One reason possibly was the continuing conflict with the Mughals, which had convinced the Gurus, first Guru Hargobind and then Guru Gobind Singh, about the necessity of armed resistance for the defense of the Panth. 8. It was also probably because of the rise of the Jat peasantry among the Sikhs, as carrying arms and resolving disputes through the use of arms were already part of Jat cultural tradition and to which the other components of the Sikh community, the Khatri traders, were not perhaps very averse to. 9. The founding of the Khalsa projected the Sikh community as a militant outfit, although all Sikhs were not necessarily its members. The Jat peasants continued to dominate the Khalsa at the expense of the older Khatri leadership. Their aspiration for equality was further fulfilled when Guru Gobind Singh decided to terminate the position of Guru after his death. The power of the Guru henceforth was to be vested in the Panth and the Granth, sacred texts. Thus, by invoking cultural resources, such as the sacred texts, and prescribing initiation and other life cycle rituals, the Khalsa sought to provide order in the life of the Sikhs in otherwise uncertain days of the 18th century, and in this way tried to construct a distinctive Sikh social and political identity.